exchanged views on the practical matters of our cooperation in this new status. Among these matters that we discussed were pretty urgent ones, as organizing work on opening embassies of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic in Moscow, and opening Russian diplomatic missions in Donetsk and Lugansk. We have also talked supporting with humanitarian aid to the people forcefully displaced from DPR and LPR because of the endless shelling. In Russia now, more than 100,000 of refugees like that from these two republics. And previously, obviously, as you are well aware, we have provided humanitarian aid to Donbass that has become a victim, fell victim to the armed aggression of Ukrainian nationalists who came to power because of anti-constitutional coup d'etat under the Russophobic, blatantly Russophobic slogans. Back then, no one paid attention to that, and as a result of that, Russophobia and neo-Nazism has become a foundation of the Ukrainian regime, and it's all brought the country to this deep tragedy, this great tragedy. And among the measures that the perpetrators of genocide in Ukraine have made at the early stage of their activities, among these things was the trade, financial blockade, total blockade of Donbass, and it continued. It lasted until the very end, with a tacit agreement from the Ukrainian handler. We had to take the significant part of helping Donbass with humanitarian cargo. More than 100 humanitarian columns were sent there. More than 100,000 of the items were delivered there. Medicines and other medical supplies, food, essentials, commodities for children and others. And as a result, because this inhumane blockade kept on with the Western countries didn't do anything about, including those who signed the Minsk agreements, we have taken a number of measures to make the life of the Donbas people easier, to resolve this problem of the access to the basic commodities. We allowed the Donbas industrial companies access to the Russian market, and also we facilitated conditions in which the Russian citizenship could be acquired by the people from Donbas. Hopefully, all the restrictions connected to the trade blockade declared by Kiev now under current circumstances is left behind, and we talked about the practical goals that we have based on the agreements on the friendship and cooperation and mutual aid. First of all, we talked about the legal framework in all the avenues of our cooperation. The practice shows that such agreements, in any case, should be dozens of such agreements. All the ministries, all the agencies and departments of the Russian Federation and their counterparts from Lugansk and Donetsk need to build relations, and they need to agree on all the rules, all the intergovernmental agreements that would serve as the basis to cooperate in economy and in military and in military technical areas and in humanitarian areas. So in all the areas, in all the avenues where normally state should function, should operate, we have reiterated our consistent support to Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in their willingness and desire to strengthen, to enhance their sovereignty and their willingness to defend their rights. First of all, the right to live on this land and the right to have cultural and language and other traditions for the population of Donbass. And these traditions were built for centuries, and Ukrainian regime attempted to put an end to it. We have agreed that we are going to hold a series of consultations among our departments. We will have internships for the personnel of the foreign ministries from Donetsk and Lugansk. And overall, I think it was a very useful conversation, so we achieved certain practical results. Now I'm ready to take your questions. Russia Today. Are you with us? Are you here? Hello, can you hear me? I can even see you. That's even better. President Zelensky was saying that the Kiev is ready for negotiations, but they want security guarantees that are allegedly not given to them. So is Moscow ready to have any negotiations? And if it does, then on what conditions? President Zelensky didn't say you the truth. He lied to you. President Zelensky mentioned negotiations in two dimensions. First, when he refused to implement Minsk agreements, and he kept appealing to his Western handlers because he wanted to gather the Normandy format meetings with a reason or without a reason, without any guarantees that these summits will bring any practical results, any practical outcomes. That's when President Zelensky wanted negotiations. And these appeals, they were aimed, and it is obvious to everyone, to replace the actual practical work that President Zelensky should have done to implement the agreements that were reached during previous summits. And the second example, when President Zelensky called on for having negotiations, was when, in overall, apart from the Minsk agreements implementation, it concerned his appeals to negotiate with him about joining NATO, giving him security guarantees from NATO. It was open. It happened just recently. Everyone heard that. And along the same lines, we heard threats that Ukraine, if it's not protected according to the Budapest Memorandum, it will be free from any obligations not to have nuclear weapons. Budapest Memorandum, everyone read the document. I hope that everyone read that. It doesn't stipulate any obligation to recognize anti-state coup d'etat. It doesn't stipulate any obligation to meet halfway the regime that perpetuated genocide against their own people, that stands against Russian language, against Russian education, against many things that directly related to the Russian culture and is an inherent part of the modern Ukrainian society, including Orthodox Church, that he also, after President Poroshenko, his predecessor, he continues to destroy it. So there is no lack of possibilities that were missed by President Zelensky. Security guarantees. We suggested talking about security guarantees last December, and he was perfectly aware of that. The only condition was that was there to agree to the demands to sign, to implement the agreements that were signed at the highest level under OSCE, so that no one tried to enhance one's security at the expense of security of the others. He didn't want to execute this obligation, and his Western handlers didn't want to implement this agreement. His patrons didn't want to implement these agreements. They kept on saying that Ukraine is free to choose any alliances to enhance its security. So he's not telling you the truth. He's lying, to be frank, when he says that they are ready to talk about neutral status. We offered any ways to enhance security, to provide security. President Putin talked about that after his conversation with President Macron. He said it openly. The NATO enlargement is unacceptable, but we want to have joint talks. We want to make joint efforts to look for the ways to guarantee security, to look for conditions, to look for opportunities that would satisfy Ukraine, the European nations, and obviously the Russian Federation. Our initiatives on enhancing security that we made last December were aimed exactly on looking guarantees beyond exploration and enlargement of the military blocs. First of all, that was our aim. So these missed opportunities, President Zelensky are well aware of them, so he shouldn't now try to put the blame on someone else. Next question, please. NBC, Kerry Simmons.
Какова цель этой операции? Вы меня слышите?
Mr. Lavrov, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Please talk. Minister, what is the goal of this operation? To overthrow democratically elected president of Ukraine, Zelensky? What is the plan to stop the operation? You say you don't want to occupy Ukraine, but when Russia will bring in pro-Russian government, how will you withdraw troops? Oh, such a serious journalist, representative of such a serious media outlet, haven't even familiarized himself with the address made by President Putin from early last morning. Can he hear us? Yes, you can go on. All the answers to all the questions you have just raised are there in his address. And once again, I would like to draw your attention that everything was absolutely clear there. We see no chance of recognizing a government as democratic that uses genocide against their own people. Just tell me, to have a better understanding of your positions that you used to cover the current developments. Does democratic society that stands for democratic values and so on, do they accept actions on banning the language that is spoken by the huge part of the population, majority of the population actually? Do this democracy that you represent make decision about banning education in Russian language, or be it any language that people speak, starting from grade 5, for example, or ban using a mother tongue in everyday life, including in stores, including in talking in hotels or in other public spaces? And do democratic societies have this habit to declare that people who are now live a certain land in Ukraine now are not people, they are not humans, they are species, as President Zelensky put it? We just remember today during our talks how President Poroshenko, when he was elected president, how he promised after democratic election, how he promised to treat his own people. He said, in our Ukraine, in Ukraine that we control, we are going to have everything: schools, kindergartens, food, welfare, and flourishing. And these ones, and he was pointing at Donbass, are going to sit in the basements. They will rot in these basements. And something like that was also said by President Zelensky when he demanded that those people who think themselves part of the Russian culture, they should go away from Ukraine. For example, if in Ireland, if they prohibited English language, what would the UK think about it? Or if in Belgium they would have forbidden French language? I can't imagine that a law like that would last for more than a couple of days or even hours. But in the West, they only see it through the prism of their own egoistical interest. So when you are accused of something, you start to make all this ruckus. But when language, cultural, religious rights of millions, many millions of people in Ukraine are being violated, you focus not on human rights. You talk about democratically, so-called democratic regime that does that. So read Putin's address. No one is going to occupy Ukraine. The goal of this operation is there in the open, to demilitarize and denazify, because constant torch marches, constant honoring Nazi officials, introducing Nazi habits as part of these so-called volunteer battalions. It is all done with the tacit agreement from the media outlets. And I can't help but mention that one reporter from CNN is doing something at the former engagement line and he's traveling across Ukraine. But all these 8 years, no one, no Western company, including media outlets, respected media outlets presented here, they didn't cover what happened at the engagement line consistently. Whereas what happened at the militia front line, 24/7, we had our journalists who showed the actual truth, how the civilian infrastructure was destroyed, how women and children are killed, how they shelled sites that in any situation must be protected, first of all. Otherwise, it is defined as the war crime. Just like NATO aviation bombed Belgrade, and they were aiming knowingly the civilian trains on the bridges. They knowingly aimed the television stations. So Ukraine regime could use this as example. But what would be the result of all that is happening now? We will see, depending on the circumstances. As President Putin said, he reaffirmed one more time that we are interested in seeing Ukrainian people independent. We want them to have the government that would represent all the people in all their versatility. And we don't want to have a situation when it is run from abroad, externally, and this management, this control wants to encourage neo-Nazism, genocide of Russians, and they want to use Ukraine as a tool of containing Russia. BBC, Steve Rosenberg. Mr. Lavrov, let's put euphemisms away. It's not a special military operation, isn't it? That's a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. How can you justify the invasion of a peaceful nation of your neighbor? How do you think? When you strike Ukraine, how do you think they will want to go to the east and not to the west? Well, talking about euphemisms, we have a lot to learn from Anglo-Saxons. Just look at the description of all the interventions that were made against Yugoslavia, and they were actually fighting for democracy. That wasn't a euphemism, so I understand it now. Look at Iraq, destruction of Libya. There they also promoted democracy, hundreds, thousands of casualties. So I'm not even going to compete with you in terms of euphemisms. And answering your question, what to do about the desire of Ukrainians who want to go there or here, they should have thought about that from the very start, when back in 2008, President Putin at the summit of NATO Russia in Bucharest, he warned them to think thrice, the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, before they state proudly that Ukraine and Georgia would be admitted to NATO. And they were saying that it was a great compromise that Germany and France succeeded in, who replaced the American preposition about stating that Ukraine and Germany will be given a roadmap to eventually join NATO. Back then, he said, just think about it. Be reasonable. Why do you treat an independent country like that, who are just strengthening, enhancing their security at the moment? And already back then, he said what he wrote in his article, how fragile is the Ukrainian state, how carefully one should treat it. But our NATO counterparts, without any euphemisms, they just went right there. And they pursued only one goal. You talked about the west of Ukraine or east of the Ukraine. They wanted to subjugate the Russian language, the Russian people of Ukraine, to the pro-Bandera mentality. Already back then, I'm sure they had this goal in mind. And not to use any euphemism. What we want is Ukrainian people, or as President Putin put it, all the peoples that inhabit the modern Ukraine had the opportunity to freely, without any attempts to put them in the restrictions of Bandera mentality, they must have a chance to determine their own future. Russia will provide dematerialization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine. We suffered too much from Nazism, and the same goes from Ukraine. So we can't just stand idly and look away from what is happening there. But about demilitarization, everything is well known. It's in the open. Just read the American colonels and generals who are retired. Unfortunately, they start saying the truth after they retire. In unison, they all say that the United States would have never agreed to deploying the weapons that would make their neighbors militarized. So since we are talking about the year 2008 and the Bucharest summit, back then envoy of the U.S. NATO, Ivo Dalton, later he called this decision made in Bucharest the biggest mistake in the history of the alliance, without any euphemisms. The Chinese Media Corporation of China, the floor is yours. I'm sorry. My name is Matthew Chen. I'm from CNN. Well, he's not polite. He works in Ukraine now, so he was contaminated with this unpoliteness virus. Chinese corporation takes the floor now. Because CNN after BBC, now that's too much. I'm in Kyiv now, Mr. Lavrov, and Kyiv is bombarded, is shelled. Please give the floor to Chinese journalists. Why Russian forces are now coming here and encircling the city? Please, be so kind, allow a Chinese journalist to ask her question. Yes, we are listening. Chinese Media Corporation, you can ask your question, please. Matthew, can you stay silent for a while? You weren't given the floor. If you are in Ukraine and they somehow ruin your good manners, we have nothing to do with that. That's not our fault. Once again, be so kind. Chinese Media Corporation. Has something happened? Is anything wrong? What's there? We have no audio. I can read it because they sent, yes, let's do this. They sent a question, just 1 second. How do you think will Western sanctions have any impact on Russia? So what is your take on this measure since this special operation started? Could there be diplomatic way to settle? We have always stood for the diplomatic solution, and Russia played the most significant role to lay the safe foundation for the diplomatic path. I mean the Minsk agreements, because before the Minsk agreements, both Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics who have declared their independence, they didn't want to change this decision that was made by their population. It was Russia that played a significant role, decisive role, in convincing them to sign the Minsk Accords, in accordance with which they were supposed to be given territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine if Donbass was given a special status, the Russian language, first of all, the right to have their own law enforcement agencies, special economic ties with Russia. So something along this line was the most important thing. And that status should have been enshrined in the Constitution of Ukraine. They should have had amnesty. They should have relieved completely the trade and economic blockade introduced by Poroshenko. And they were supposed to have elections in accordance with, in agreement with these republics. So all this foundation was destroyed. And consistently, all these 7 years after Minsk agreements were signed, on numerous times we tried to convince both Kyiv and their Western patrons, Berlin, Paris, Washington, to make Kiev regime to implement these key items, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine depended on this. If they just agreed to elementary basic language rights of the Donbas population, no one even moved a finger to change this blatant sabotage perpetuated by both Poroshenko and Zelensky after him to stop this sabotage. Our appeals and public appeals also, we tried to ask our Western counterparts, but that was just crying out in the middle of the desert. Unfortunately, no one heeded us. And I cannot believe that Western politicians and diplomats consistently, categorically refuting any attempts to make Kiev to implement the Minsk agreements. They thought that would go on forever. We would just stand idly watching at how Russians are oppressed, how Russian language is banned. Just answer me this. If in Ireland they will ban English language, what would be your reaction? I'm asking my Western interlocutors now, of course. So we had enough chances to resolve this conflict diplomatically, and any armed operations aimed at restoring some kind of democratic order without elements of genocide, without neo-Nazism, without militarization. Obviously, we will go back to these negotiations. And once again, I want you to remember Putin's words. We want upper liberating Ukraine from militarization and neo-Nazism. We want to give the chance to all the peoples that inhabit this country to determine their own future without any pressure exerted from the outside. The final question, Matthew Chance from CNN, please. Thank you so much. Can I ask a question? Could you please say if there is a chance for negotiations? I represent Sujitian from China, and we think that the negotiations should take place. And if these negotiations were to take place, then with who? The US, NATO, Ukraine? The chance to have negotiations was possible until the very end. A month ago, I reported to Mr. Putin what was the reaction from our counterparts in North Atlantic Treaty Organization, first of all in the U.S., to our proposal to agree on fair security guarantees. And such guarantees would be fair and just based on the decisions made by in OSCE at the highest level, in a fair way, not in some sly way, as it was interpreted by the collective West when they said that any country can choose whatever military alliances they want, but there was a restriction not to enhance one's security at the expense of the security of the others. They ignored it. They said nothing about it. They were saying that just the Russian interpretation. We cannot accept such moves, such tricks in regard of the document adopted at the highest level. The same goes to the Minsk agreements. The West wanted to take only what they wanted from that. Give us the border under the control of Ukrainian authorities, and then that would be all right. Forget about the amnesty, spatial status, elections, and so on. So we had plenty of negotiations, but when negotiations are replaced with sabotaging, blatantly sabotaging any agreements, and when at the same time Russia was accused that it's Russia's fault that the Minsk agreements are not implemented, that's just the brazen, boorish behavior. So the Western counterparts are known for that, but now it exceeded all normal lines because the Russian speakers in Ukraine had it worse and worse. I already gave you example of what happened to Russian language, Russian education, Russian Orthodox Church. Just try to look at your traditions. Try to measure it up to your traditions. If you thought about it in this key, you would have understood that no one would have stood for it. But we are ready for negotiations at any moment. As soon as the Ukrainian military forces will heed the words of our president, they will stop resistance, lay down their weapons. No one wants to attack them. No one wants to oppress them. They can go back to their families, and Ukrainian people should be given this chance by all of us to determine their future by themselves. And now the final question from CNN. Yes? Hello? Thank you so much for taking my question, for agreeing to take my question. I'm in Ukrainian capital right now. And I'm seeing that the outskirts of the city are being shelled. And we have been watching it for some time now. My question is basic one. It's very simple. Do you want to behead Ukrainian leadership and to replace it with pro-Russian? I'm sorry, maybe I missed your reply already, but I want to ask you to answer this question. Do you plan to behead Ukrainian leadership? Are you going to repeat it for the third time now? Because I heard you all right the first time. Once again, I will explain it to you. You don't want to listen to me. I tried to draw attention when I answered the questions from the two previous representatives of the Western media outlets, and I wanted to draw your attention to what President Putin said. I understand that probably you have no time to read the explanations that describe Russian position, but please, I invite you to do that. And if you are in Ukraine now, you should also advise your Ukrainian counterparts and people from the Ukrainian armed forces to read that. No one is going to attack Ukrainian people, and no one is going to humiliate the Ukrainian servicemen in any way. We are only talking about not allowing neo-Nazis and those who promote genocide to rule in this country. Because now the regime that rules in Kiev, reigns in Kiev, it has above them two mechanisms of the Western control. The West led by the US, and secondly, neo-Nazis who try to promote their so-called culture, and now it's flourishing in Ukraine. As for your feelings of a person who is in Kiev right at this moment now, once again, I would like to underscore that read what Putin said. No strikes against civilian infrastructure are made. No strikes against the barracks or dorms of the Ukrainian servicemen. So no strikes are made against that infrastructure. And stats that the data that we have now proves that. And as a representative of the free media outlet, I would like to ask you, why? I have just mentioned that when I answered the previous question, I touched upon that topic. Why all these 8 years, no one from the Western media didn't cover consistently what was happening in the territory, in the Western engagement line controlled by Ukraine? And if you are so horrified about what is happening in Kyiv now, has anyone from CNN visited Donbass? Did they see schools that were destroyed? Did they see how women who were carrying babies were killed? How they were bombing the children's beach areas? Has anyone gone there? I think that you should ask these questions based on facts. And these facts are in the address made by President Putin. Thank you so much for your participation. We are concluding the press conference. Thank you.